Good morning. I'm Tyler McCann, Chief Engagement Officer at the Canadian Agri-food Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, an important note about language interpretation. This webinar includes simultaneous interpretation in English and French. Please ensure you have selected the correct language that you will listen in. To select the appropriate language, please locate and click on the globe icon at the bottom taskbar of this window, or more if you are on a mobile device, and select either English or French. Le budget fédéral a inclus des investissements historiques dans le secteur agroalimentaire. Mais est-ce que ces investissements étaient assez pour encourager de la croissance verte? Est-ce que l'accent sur l'environnement a désavantagé les autres priorités du secteur? Est-ce que les investissements historiques sont un signe que le gouvernement est en train de reconnaître l'importance du secteur comme solution naturelle au changement climatique et aux enjeux des croissances économiques? Et est-ce que ces investissements sont assez pour dépolitiser les enjeux agro-environnementaux? These are some of the questions our panel will tackle today. But first, I would like to take a few minutes to introduce the Canadian Agri-food Policy Institute for those of you who may not be familiar with CAPI. L'ICPA est un institut qui dirige, catalyse et coordonne des analyses stratégiques indépendantes sur les nouveaux enjeux agroalimentaires, engage les dialogues avec les intervenants et fait progresser les politiques publiques. CAPI helps create venues for critical conversations between those who have creative ideas to contribute and those who are making impactful policy decisions. A great way to be involved with CAPI is to become a partner or supporter of the work accomplished through our registered charity, the Canadian Agri-food Foundation, which supports the work of CAPI. Your commitment is vital, as it is urgent to intensify our efforts, as agriculture and agri-food can be essential solution providers for the economy, environment, health, food, and global food security, but creative policy changes are essential. Before we officially begin today's program, and I pass things over to our moderator, we have a few housekeeping items to review. During the webinar, participant audio and video will be turned off. As an attendee, you cannot be seen or heard by others. Participants can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of their screens. Due to the time limits, the moderator may not be able to ask all questions submitted. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on our YouTube channel. The link to the recording will be shared with all participants after the event. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Deborah Yedlin. Deborah Yedlin was elected the 14th Chancellor of the University of Calgary in July 2018. Deborah has been observing, commenting, and writing about business and politics for more than 2 decades as a journalist for the Financial Post, Globe and Mail, and Calgary Herald newspapers. In addition to her writing, she has been a regular commentator for CBC Radio and Television and CTV since 1996. Much of her focus as of late has been on the energy sector and how it must adapt if it is to remain a significant contributor to Canada's economy. You may have read her article in the Globe and Mail just a few weeks ago about how failure is not an option for Canada's next generation of energy leaders. I'd say the same is true for our agri-food industry as well. Her knowledge of complex industries and their uphill battle to adapt and reform makes her an excellent choice to guide our conversation today. With that, I will pass it over to you, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Tyler, and it's great to be here today to moderate this panel discussion on Budget 2021. Before I get started, I just would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge I'm moderating this session from the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Dakota, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. I'd also like to acknowledge that the City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We have a great array of panelists this morning, and I'm going to introduce each of them. And following their introduction, we will have them offer some introductory remarks, and then we will open it up to a lively, what I'm sure will be a very lively discussion. Dr. Al Mussell is research lead and founder of Agri-food Economic Systems. Prior to this, Al was Senior Research Associate at the George Morris Centre in Guelph, Ontario. He is past president of the Canadian Agricultural Economic Society and has served on the board of the Progressive Dairy Operator. He currently serves as past chair of the Ontario Pork Industry Council. The Honourable Anne McLellan is Senior Advisor at Bennett Jones. She has served 4 terms as the Liberal MP for Edmonton Centre, during which she was Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Minister of Health, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and Minister of Natural Resources. Dr. Karen Ross is the Director of Farmers for Climate Solutions, a national alliance of over 20,000 farmers advancing climate solutions in Canadian agriculture. Karen has a PhD from Western University and comes to Farmers for Climate Solutions with experience leading a national program advancing policies and communications on soil, greenhouse gases, and agriculture at a Quebec-based NGO and as a policy researcher on sustainable food systems in Canada and abroad. Sean Speer is currently the PPF Scotiabank Fellow in Strategic Competitiveness at the Public Policy Forum. He's also an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Moncks School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Sean previously served as Senior Economic Advisor to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for being here. We're going to start with comments from Karen, and then I will move to Al, Anne, and Sean. So Al, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Deborah. I think there's a slide deck we were going to bring up. Okay, thanks. Could we go to the next slide? Trying to assess a federal budget, voluminous document. I guess my approach to it was to try and sort of get a bit of a sense of what some of the strategic issues the federal government would be wanting to try and address, and then compare that with, to some extent, what was identified and funded in the budget. I guess as an agricultural researcher, the federal budget is, not perhaps a capstone document that comes out in the course of a year, because typically it's a small element of agricultural policy programming, because so much of it is tied up in statutory programs such as the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. But of course, this year is a very different year. Thinking about some of the federal priorities in agri-food that occur to me, at least, and I'm going to say more about each of these. Food supply chain resilience has got to be an important issue to the government. The needs for infrastructure shaped by the pandemic and otherwise are important. Pressures for change in BRM programming are an ongoing issue. We're probably at least 3 years into this, and that has only escalated over the last 12 months or so. We have important trade matters, new, others ongoing, and also the climate change dialogue and where agriculture plays into that. And of course, the budget signals the priorities that government is placing on these and other issues and the choices that they're making. We go to the next slide, please. So a few thoughts framing the context. As I'll discuss in a moment, we do have sharply increasing federal levels of debt, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. Our agri-food supply chains were tested during the pandemic, and there's very little in terms of redundancies in those supply chains. More and more of a just-in-time model. These were tested. In my understanding of it, and in a lot of what's been written over the last few months, those supply chains generally retained their integrity. We did not have a lot of calamities that come out of it, but we certainly got to see firsthand some of the unprecedented risks that we could have faced, and whether it was prudence or good luck that we avoided. And there's probably merit in addressing those with policy priorities. Infrastructure upgrades are a constant issue for the public sector, whether it's federal or provincial governments, to support innovation, adoption of technology, changing expectations. So, just a couple of examples. Rural broadband, which was targeted in the federal budget is an aspect of technology adoption. If you don't have it, there's certain technologies that don't work very well for you, or just can't go ahead. With regard to change, we always have changing expectations in the food system, but in particular, as we anticipate that climate change is going to move forward on us, we've got changing expectations in terms of things like building codes and flooding risks, and both of those were addressed in the budget document. As we have for at least 3 years, maybe longer than that, ongoing disparity among provinces, different commodities, federal governments in terms of how BRM programming, particularly agri-stability, is structured and how that is funded. Now, my understanding is the announced changes in the form of the reference margin limits being taken off and the increase in coverage of losses to 80% were covered in a fall economic statement. So funds have been requested for that. But this has not relieved the pressure on this issue, particularly regionally between Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ottawa. So again, typically this wouldn't be an issue that'd come up because it's a statutory program, but if that's going to be addressed, more funds will be required presumably, and that would need to be requested. The budget contains some reference to adjustments required relative to trade agreements. It was no surprise that compensation was funded for aspects of the dairy and poultry industries relative to the CPTPP agreement. Some funds were announced, but with really little detail given relative to a settlement of an ongoing dispute brought against Canada by Australia on wine excise taxes. Some concern that there wasn't a little bit more detail in terms of how the domestic industry is being addressed, domestic grape growers and small wineries in that aspect. And then finally, I'm going to say a little bit more about agriculture as a solutions provider for climate change commitments. We go to the next slide, Elise. This chart plots out net federal debt relative to GDP. And as you can see, Canada came into the pandemic situation with a debt situation relative to its GDP, and it had been in decline, in relatively good shape compared with many other countries. The opinion of our big macroeconomic thinkers, David Dodge, Stephen Poloz, others, is of course public debt is always a concern, but provided that it's invested in items that can improve productivity growth in the economy, including the agri-food economy, we have some capacity to do that. Now, the other caveat in the mix, of course, is interest rates and inflation. And one way to think of it is that in Canada, if we do not maintain productivity growth that gets ahead of inflation and stays ahead of interest rate increases that combat inflation, then we have a serious quandary. So we have to keep that in the back of our mind. But for now, I think the thinking is that there's capacity here, provided that it's invest in productivity. We go to the next slide, please, Elise. The risk of our dialogue, and I hope this doesn't happen today, is the whole thing could be taken over by climate change and carbon, as this has become a deep, deep concern in Canada, including in agri-food. What I have here is a table that's taken out of the executive summary of the analysis that goes behind kind of the guidance document the federal government is using, healthy environment and healthy economy. And I've circled here, you look at the various segments of the economy, the line item that is listed as agriculture. Now there's a lot of interpretation that goes on here, so we have to be really careful. Essentially, that is livestock related. So it's enteric fermentation and emissions from livestock, as well as fertilizer and some soil emissions. When we go to 2030 and compare it against 2005, this is the only sector of the economy that is projected to increase. As somebody who works in agriculture, maybe like many of the rest of you, I found that very surprising because, of course, in agriculture, we have the capability to fix carbon. unlike almost every other industry. So that's surprising, and you would think that if that's what's being forecast, this is a clear area for investment by the government. Now, a little bit more explanation, and I'll try to be brief with how all this is done. And Karen's going to come on, who probably understands this better than I do. I'm sure she does, actually. The energy and emissions used in fuels that power things like farm equipment, et cetera, are in the energy segment of this table. The carbon sequestration is actually down in the land use. It's called LUCF, land use change in forestry. That's where it's listed. You can see that it's projected to decrease. Well, we weren't even counting it in 2005. It's very much of a sink. But one of the questions that is going to come up here is what we believe, or what aspects of science tell us in terms of what can be sequestered, particularly the capacity of prairie soils to sequester carbon, and what changes in agricultural practices can do, and conversely, what funds from a budget can do to help create incentives to do that at a more improved way. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'm going to conclude here with something. These are whole of economy sets of information that frankly I find concerning. So this is much broader than just agriculture and food, but our submissions from the middle of this month to the UN tell us that since 2005, our overall greenhouse gas emissions are down about 1%. Meanwhile, the analysis on, as far as I can tell, it's a comparable time period, US greenhouse gas emissions are down 21%. And there's some reasons for that. US electric production moving off of coal and onto natural gas. It's probably the biggest factor. But that's a big difference between Canada and the United States. And at the same time, we've got conversations going on in which the US is talking about how they would contemplate border fees for jurisdictions and products that don't have the same level of emissions or emission reduction protocols in place as they do. That's got to be of great concern to CEOs in Canada, banks in Canada, corporate and public leaders in Canada. Maybe I'll stop there, Deborah, and I'll turn it back over to you.
I will ask Karen to take over from Al and offer her thoughts.
Thanks so much, Deborah. Thanks, Al. Great opening. I'll just share my screen here, get started with a quick presentation as well. So Al quickly mentioned it. I mean, we saw a huge investment in climate, in agriculture in this budget. So, all taken together, we're talking well over $300 million invested directly into farmers to adopt practices, tools, technologies this season and next season to reduce our sector's emissions. And Al said it right. One big part of the problem here is that our sector's emissions are rising through until 2030. Al showed that in a table. I'm showing that in a bit of a graph, but you see the increase between 2020 and 2030. And I'll ask you to take a look at the timeline. We're in growing season 2021 right now, which means we have 9 left until the Paris Accord. And of course, Paris is important in terms of Canada succeeding in meeting its international commitments to reduce emissions, and agriculture should and must be a part of that. And I think the bottom line is that farmers want to be a part of this. Ultimately, it's really important to remember that farmers are among some of the most impacted by climate change in Canada. We're seeing more moisture in our fields when we don't want it, more dryness when we don't want it, early frost and late frost, severe storms that are really impacting our ability to make harvests and livelihoods off the land. So addressing climate change is both urgent and an imperative for our sector. And I just want to say that, listen, it's no longer just environmentalists or scientists who are kind of leading the charge on this. It's also our market. So, from local small supply chains to much, much larger supply chains, global supply chains, from General Mills to PepsiCo to McDonald's, all making pledges, charting visions and hopefully pathways to reduce emissions to 2030 and to 2050. So, the concern in front of us, or the challenge in front of us, also potentially, the opportunity to address this challenge isn't just about the environment, it's actually economic too. If farmers don't quickly innovate to change practice to reduce emissions, we may risk losing market share and competitiveness. And Al notes that, our international peers, at least across sectors, may be doing better than we are so far. So the question for me then is no longer, do we need to change? And I don't even think it's any longer, how can we change? Because there's tried and tested practices, proven practices that farmers are already adopting across acres in Canada that are reducing our sector's emissions. I think the real question we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of support do we need to be able to transition to lower GHG, lower emission practices? So a quick tour around the world. This is pre-budget 2021. So pre-last Monday, we did a quick tour around the world to see, how some of our international competitors stack up in terms of public investments that directly support farmers to adopt practices that can reduce emissions. And you'll note that the European Union countries invest about 73 times more than Canada did, and the US about 13 times more. And, in my opinion, this lack of proactive investment is actually leading to much more expensive consequences. So a recent CAPI report from last year shows this value, 4.3 billion in environmental damages. But let's focus on farm gates too, right? Environment and Climate Change Canada, in that report that Al was mentioning, flags the fact that our sector, so farmers themselves, were losing $2 billion in farm damages due to severe storms that are directly related to climate events. So the problem is worsening. We need proactive investments. And I think that's what we saw on Monday. So Farmers for Climate Solutions for the past 6 months or so paired up with some of Canada's ag economists out of the University of Guelph, in my opinion, some of Canada's best GHG modelers in agriculture, to try to answer the question, if we could get an unprecedented investment in agriculture this year and next, what kind of programs could offer the highest impact? So which programs would be approachable to farmers, as in what practices can we adopt today, this season, next season, to be part of Canada's climate solution, or to advance our role in being part of Canada's climate solution? And also that would be cost effective, as in, dollars per ton matter. How much we're spending per ton of emissions reduced is important. So we wanted to know kind of the cost effectiveness of these practices. And we also wanted to know the overall impact in terms of GHGs. So together over 6 months, we worked from a very, very long list of best management practices to narrow it down to 5. And just broadly speaking, you can see the numbers on your screen here, but we were seeking $300 million invested in this budget for, in essence, 5 big practices. So improving nitrogen management, increasing adoption of cover cropping, normalizing rotational grazing, protecting wetlands and trees on farms, and beginning the transition to move beyond diesel, or at least increase efficiency in fuel use. And finally, the last program we were advocating for, which didn't land in the budget, but which the government is addressing in kind of a different way, is a program to build community and motivation around the opportunity of adopting low GHG practices. So again, farmers across Canada are already adopting these kinds of practices. We'd love to surround them with big communications campaigns, more peer-to-peer knowledge exchanges, so that all of a sudden, doing cover cropping or improving your nitrogen management isn't seen as weird. It's just started, it's seen as normal. So long story short, working with these experts led by farmers, $300 million investment could lead to about 10 megatons reduction. So you'll remember Al's numbers. This is not significant. This is about 1/7 of our sector's emissions in just a few growing seasons. All of a sudden, positioning farmers with the right kinds of supports that allow us to be part of Canada's climate solution. So I'll leave it at that, just with this final slide here. This is the cover of our report with our website at the bottom there, farmersforclimatesolutions.ca. If you like to dig into any of those details of the numbers, I welcome you to go there. I just want to perhaps conclude by saying ultimately what we saw on Monday was an investment of $270 million into all 5 of those priorities. So, you know, with the right kind of program design, quick implementation that's approachable to farmers, I think we're well on our way to taking, you know, a big first step in supporting farmers in a meaningful way to reduce emissions this season. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Anne? You're on mute. Nope, can't hear you. There you go.
There we go. Deborah, I think my only credential for being on this panel is that I was born on a dairy farm outside Truro, Nova Scotia, and my family still run that dairy farm and have built it up and out, and it's quite a significant economic enterprise now. But let me step back, I think, a little bit. And when you look at this budget, and you've heard about some aspects of the budget from Al and the climate part just from Karen now, I think if you step back and think about where this government's approach to the future of agriculture comes from, you have to go back to Dominic Barton in 2016, when then Finance Minister Bill Morneau asked Dominic, now our ambassador to China, to chair the council, the Advisory Council on Economic Growth. And Dominic Barton chose to highlight in his report, among other sectors for economic growth, agriculture. And what did he tell the government of Canada and all of us, quite truthfully, about agriculture? One, huge potential to add to the economic growth of the nation, and a potential that we had let slide actually for decades. And so what was his prescription in terms of trying to speak to the future and fix some of that? One, obviously, value add, more processing. And we've talked a lot about this in this country, in governments I've been involved with, Sean's been involved with, and so on. But the value add proposition, we sell too many raw materials, unprocessed foodstuffs, commodities, canola, grain, whatever, to the world, high quality, safely produced, responsibly produced, but we do not process it and add value. That was the first thing he said. Second, enhanced productivity, obviously. How, as one of the great nations, nations of the world, 6% of the arable land in the world, why aren't we more productive in terms of helping feed ourselves and the rest of the world? And productivity speaks to things like technology adaptation. It speaks to accelerating that adaptation, technology use, automation, robotics, digitization, all those kinds of things to enhance productivity. And then thirdly, he talked about trade agreements and the fact that it's important for Canada, a trading nation, to have as many agreements as possible on as positive terms as possible, so we are opening new markets to these, hopefully, more value-add products that we can sell around the world. I think that is the frame of much of this budget for the agricultural sector. If you break down the component parts, and yes, there are a lot of little bits of programs, and they may not always mention agriculture, but if you put the budget and the agricultural sector in that frame that Dominic Martin put in place, I think you start to see a lot that can drive economic growth in the agricultural sector for this country. And I'm just outrageously going to use one example, which is headquartered here in Alberta, in terms of where this government and this budget sees ag going. And that is an initiative called CANE. It's the Canadian Agri-food Automation and Intelligence Network. It is a partnership, which is so important in this country, between the Government of Canada through CIF, the Strategic Innovation Fund, which rests in ISET, right? And SIF receives new funding, and agriculture is specifically mentioned in relation to SIF. And people might not always think first of agriculture in relation to SIF, but they should. And the Canadian Agri-food Automation and Intelligence Network is this wonderful partnership between the Government of Canada, between Alberta Innovates, between the Forestry Department here in Alberta, between private sector companies in ag and food processing across the country. It's a pan-Canadian initiative. It's headquartered here in Alberta, and it is driving exactly what Dominic Barton talked about in terms of enhanced productivity and the application of technology to the future of ag. And what are some of the things they're looking at? They're looking at the application of AI, the application of genomics, the building out of the smart farm of the future, pilot projects, farms across this country where people can come and learn and see the potential of technology and enhanced productivity and value add. So I think those kinds of programs in the budget speak to the overarching frame in which this government sees ag. I would also say, you know, the super cluster program. We have in Regina a world-class protein super cluster. And that is what does the world need? Well, it needs a lot of things, but it needs more protein. And as emerging economies develop middle classes, we've heard and seen this story, they need more protein, whether it's meat or whether it's pulses or whatever the case may be, right? And that protein supercluster in Regina, supported by the superclusters program, again, the fundamental research that's being done there that will, if we get it right, drive the productivity and make Canada again a superpower in the world when it comes to agriculture. I represented the city of Edmonton for over 12 years in the Parliament of Canada, an urban environment, but I could never understand why our province here in Alberta let go of well, I guess we can all understand why, because there was easier money apparently to be made elsewhere. This province was based on agriculture. Agriculture was the foundation of the province of Alberta. And now, finally, we're starting to realize that it is a fundamental and key part of our future. And I think I also sit on the board of Invest Alberta to attract foreign direct investment to our province. One of our key pillars is agriculture, diversification of agriculture, value add to agriculture. Because all of a sudden, in this country, we're starting to see that agriculture is going to be a huge part of our future, not only in terms of feeding and sustaining our own people, but an engine of economic growth for us in terms of the rest of the world. I will stop there.
Go Alberta. Thank you. And Sean, last but not least.
That's a tough act to follow. Let me just make a couple of brief comments, and then we can open it up to questions and comments from others. Thank you to Cappy for inviting me to participate, although I should say that my connection to agriculture is even more tenuous than Anne's. I didn't grow up on a farm. The best I can say is that my in-laws have a farm. But I've taken a growing interest in agriculture, agri-food, and the broader policy framework around the sector in the context of my work at the Public Policy Forum on Canadian competitiveness, because as Anne says, if you're going to think about the future of Canadian competitiveness, you cannot neglect agriculture. Not only has the Barton panel, as Anne says, rightly identified the sector is a source for future growth, but I think the sector table at ISED has produced a similarly important roadmap for leveraging Canada's pre-existing comparative advantages in the sector in the name of driving export growth and economic output more generally. And so it's in that vein that I I come to you, I feel a bit like an imposter, but it's from the vantage point of how do we solve for what I believe is Canada's most significant challenge, which is that we've been growing at less than 2% per year since the start of this century. And if we're going to break out of this 2% trap, we're going to have to have a greater degree of ambition about the parts of the economy where Canada can compete globally for market share. And that begins with agriculture and agri-food. If you just look at the Canadian economy dispassionately, analytically, there are no other parts of the economy where Canada plays such a significant role in global market share. I mean, for all of the attention we pay to autos and aerospace and so on, I mean, these sectors are a fraction of global market share compared to some agricultural commodities like canola and others. This is truly where Canada does have a global advantage, and we need to start thinking that way. The reason why I like Anne's presentation so much is because that's the energy and ambition and kind of urgency that I think we need to have. And I, notwithstanding all of the various policy areas that Anne cited, I think it regrettably too often Canadian governments, and this isn't a partisan observation, it's one that extends across different governments, I think has for a host of reasons not tended to place agriculture at the center of that of a national growth strategy. And the inclusion of agriculture in CIF, I think, is hopefully a sign that Canadian policymakers are beginning to recognize that an industrial strategy for Canada, a strategy designed to break out of this 2% trap, needs to put agriculture and agri-food closer to the center of the agenda. If that's indeed a positive sign, I think that's good for the sector. It's good for the country. Because notwithstanding some of the pre-existing advantages we have, there are some headwinds that ought to concern us. R&D as a share of sales is flat or declining. Patents coming out of the sector are flat and declining. There are other metrics that show that the progress that we've made on technological adoption and productivity enhancing investments has been slowing, and those are all going to be impediments to maximizing this advantage, not just for the country, of course, but for the communities where agriculture is so important. So I liked both Anne's presentation for the kind of frame, and she called us an agricultural superpower. I think that's precisely the message that needs to be communicated both to policymakers and to the Canadian public. I wrote a column last month in the National Post that criticized both the Prime Minister and Conservative Party leader Erin O'Toole for their Canadian Agriculture Day statements. That I thought, they were generally non-objectionable, but they failed to kind of capture the growth and the dynamism and the opportunity reflected in Anne's presentation. This isn't, there was a sort of almost pastoral element to the way that they talked about this sector, as opposed to talking about it the way it ought to be talked about, which is the source of innovation and productivity and growth and dynamism that is just an enormous endowment for this country, and one that we need to recognize and build a kind of policy framework around to cultivate, sustain, and ultimately to strengthen. And so I think maybe just as I wrap up, Deborah, one some of the commitments in the budget to expand support around technological adoption are really important. The signal that agriculture is going to be part of CIF, is that sign that I mentioned, that Canadian policymakers are starting to put agriculture closer to the center of a growth agenda. And then just lastly, on Karen's presentation with respect to climate change. I think the sector has a tremendous story to tell, or at least parts of the sector do, and hopefully these investments can build on that and ultimately turn net zero emission targets into an opportunity to enhance productivity on Canadian farms. So I guess just in sum, I'm as kind of bullish on agriculture as Anne, and I think for those who are participating today, I think we have a collective responsibility to try to change the conversation at the level of policy, at the level of the Canadian public, even amongst industry, to really think about this sector as at the core, at the center of Canada's growth into the future. Expanding agriculture is ultimately the way Canada is going to get out of the 2% trap that I talked about earlier.
Thanks, Sean, and thank you to all the panelists for their comments. I couldn't help but think that we could have substituted energy for agriculture in so many of the things that were discussed, whether it's value add, export markets, emissions reduction, increasing productivity, the need to adopt technology to decrease emissions. It's telling the story better. This is an issue that faces energy as much as it does obviously face agriculture. I just want to start with a question that came in from Chris McQueen about value-added agriculture, asking Anne, saying that we need to sell more of our products on a value-added basis. So the question is, how can governments, federal, provincial, even municipal, ensure that legislation enables agriculture, allowing value-added agriculture operations, processing, et cetera, so that the new funding will incent agriculture to invest in technologies and innovation? So what kind of support do we need from a legislative perspective to ensure that we move the sector moves towards adopting value-added opportunities? I'll start with Anne, and I think Sean would like to weigh in after that, if I'm not mistaken.
Just a couple of things that come to top of mind. Regulatory review, I think, is important here in terms of, do we have the right regulations? Do we have smart regulations? And Sean and I both firsthand know how hard it is to try and streamline within the government of Canada regulatory regimes. But I do think that probably a very thorough look at regulations around the agri-food sector, processing, and so on. The other thing I would say is in terms of fundamental research, right? The value add, we can't keep doing, food processing, whatever it is, in the same old ways, right? So we need to ensure that we're incenting, first of all, the necessary research, the knowledge, develop the knowledge, mobilize the knowledge, and figure out what the best-in-class approaches are around processing. And that involves things like technologies for traceability of whatever it is you're producing and processing, safety, labeling, all sorts of things if you're going to engage in the global market. And I would think there's probably going to be a fair chunk of government support at provincial and federal levels to incent the private sector to move in certain directions. But I mean, look at Maple Leaf Foods. I'm not an expert and I'm not here to talk about Maple Leaf Foods, but it does seem to me that the private sector, we have innovative people in the private sector, and if they're given the right trade agreements and the right regulatory regime, they can in fact dominate a market globally. And Maple Leaf Foods, to me, is one of those examples that comes to top of mind in a whole lot of different ways. So that's all I'll say, but we have to stop making excuses about why we're not doing these things and get out there and do them.
Thanks, Anne. Sean?
Yeah, I'll just be brief, Deborah. I of course agree with what Anne just said. Positive signs, we have now a new Invest Alberta and a similar agency being stood up in Ontario called Invest Ontario. I think this is a recognition on the part of these governments that our sort of reactive approach to investment attraction has not served us well, that other competing jurisdictions, particularly American states, have been much more proactive in trying to secure capital investment, trying to secure product mandates, R&D mandates, and these sorts of things. And so, I think Canadian governments are going to have to match that level of ambition and then build policy frameworks around them. So it may involve financial subsidies, as Anne says, but I think if you look at it comprehensively, it'll involve a combination of regulatory policy, a combination of transportation policy, a whole host of other ways to try to have these firms choose to invest in Canada as opposed to competing jurisdictions. But the first step, as Anne says, is to recognize that we're in a competition. And I think it's positive to see Alberta and Ontario take institutional action to recognize that. I think the onus now is on Ottawa to kind of coordinate with those provinces so that when these opportunities arise, we can be quick, nimble, and ultimately persuasive.
Thanks, Sean. Karen, we've talked. Everybody mentioned the importance of emissions and climate change. I was wondering if you could sort of talk to us about some of the easy wins that the agriculture sector could see, and also I think what is the interaction between this drive to increase productivity, which Sean addressed, versus decreasing emissions. Where's that balance? So if you could sort of take us in that direction, then I'll ask Al to weigh in afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Good question. First of all, I don't think there's anything easy for farmers to change practice. These management decisions are always tough, and they come with a lot of risks and often a lot of upfront costs, which is why we need the kinds of supports we saw in the budget to help cover some of those upfront costs, help address knowledge barriers, these kinds of things. But I'll start with some that maybe that are adopted in Canada already and maybe are reasonably achievable this season. So, and they help to address this productivity issue as well. So I'll give two examples: cover cropping and nitrogen management. So cover cropping is a practice that helps to reduce emissions. It builds resilience on your farm, builds soil health, and often your yields are dependent on soil health. So this is a great practice for emissions. It's also a great practice for productivity in the following season of your cover cropping. We saw support for that in the federal budget. Another example is nitrogen management. Some of the leading research out of the Canadian prairies says that we can be much more efficient with the nitrogen we're using, to a point where some researchers out of Manitoba, for instance, would say we can even reduce our nitrogen fertilizer use by 20% without impacting yields. It's not going to be the same on every farm. That said, the farmer sees a benefit for that, right? That's profitability. That's money not wasted. It's also less emissions. So I think there's, so those are two, again, I want to repeat, not easy for a farmer to adopt, but realistic. I think I don't think farmers like to be bucketed at all, but I think if anything, we're all adaptable, resilient, and innovative. So I don't think the climate challenge should be the thing that stops us in our tracks. I don't think it will be. And when it comes to thinking about productivity, I think ultimately the largest threat to productivity and increasing productivity is climate change. It will be our lack of ability to adapt and our lack of ability to mitigate emissions. Because again, good policy or bad policy on climate action, the market is changing. Anne raised Maple Leaf. I'm going to get the target wrong, but I think they're charting a path to net zero already. So the question, again, as I said in the outset, isn't do we need to change? It's what do we need to change, right? And as in what kinds of supports do we need to change? And I think the practices like cover cropping and improved nitrogen management, the science is there. Leading farmers are already doing it in Canada. And as Sean says, there's great stories to be told. It's about kind of scaling those from fence post to fence post across millions of acres in Canada so that Al's chart that he mentioned at the beginning starts to reverse in direction without impacting productivity. And most specifically, Deborah, hopefully increasing farm profitability, because for me, that's what matters most, right? Margins are tight on farms, and making climate smart decisions. What we found in our work is that they're actually good in the long run for farm profitability over 3 to 5 years of adoption of all of those 5 practices we were talking about. Thanks.
Al, your thoughts?
Well, I guess first, one of the things that I think Karen made reference to it in a way we have to get past is, mitigating emissions to improve productivity is costly, but we also have to think about what the cost of doing nothing is. And I think we're coming to the realization that the cost of doing nothing is exceptionally high. And also the marketplace, Karen made reference to Maple Leaf, other food companies, processors, retailers, et cetera, that are featuring products that have been produced in a particular way. And this has gone beyond, kind of a consumer niche into now you're getting, on the side of some of Canada's export customers, we're getting export customers that are just going to blanket require certain standards. So it's gotten, I think, out of the sort of groovy and niche and into something really quite important and accepted. I guess real quickly, one of the challenges I think we have here is one of the ways we get there, I think, and it has to be understood within a context, is intensification. So probably the least sustainable thing we can do is take pristine land and convert it into agricultural use. So what that means is we have to find ways to manage our carbon emissions and increase yields, whether it's a crop or it's daily gains, feed conversion, or livestock. We have to find ways to be able to do that, and that's been a long-term push for us. But we cannot let up on that. We can probably target it perhaps differently, but we can't let up on that. The other thing that I don't know if the others find this confusing, but you've got this issue of intensity of production versus what we're doing, which is aggregate reporting, and this you kind of toggle back and forth between what one another means. This is something, maybe over time as we get more familiar with it, we'll be able to use it more effectively. I get confused over it.
Can you perhaps talk about a little bit more about what that means? For perhaps not everybody in the audience is as familiar with it as you are.
Yeah, sure. So going back to those tables that I made reference to, the countries report this. So we've got national levels of megatons in agriculture, in land use, change in forestry, et cetera. But as you're watching a carcass go by the rail or a bushel of grain, that doesn't mean that bushel of grain necessarily had a particular spec relative to that aggregate number. It's difficult to toggle between the two of them. And the information bundle that goes with products that are produced in a particular way relative to that big aggregate number that will be recognized in the Polaris Accord. That's a toggle we're going to have to manage and provide better information interpretation of, I think.
Well, I think so much of it comes down to adopting technology to be able to track from a food security perspective as much as it is from an emissions standpoint. And I think that's where I'm hearing, we're going to be seeing a lot more movement from a policy standpoint and from an industry standpoint. I actually wanted to follow up just a question. We're seeing a lot of very interesting partnerships in the United States between agriculture and energy, everybody looking to achieve goals that are similar, shared goals. I'm just wondering if we've started to see that sort of activity in Canada. Why or why not? And I'm just thinking as an example, Chevron has partnered with Cal Biogas to produce renewable natural gas. That's a big win on both sides. Are we going to see partnerships like that start to be formed in Canada? What are the barriers to that happening? And I'm happy to, whoever would like to answer that, I'm happy to have that as a jump ball. Karen, perhaps, or Al?
I would just say, Deborah, while I don't purport to be an expert on this specific question, I think it's precisely the kind of steps that we need to take, both in terms of advancing climate goals, as you say, but more fundamentally, I think to do what I was talking about earlier, which is to sort of reorient how Canadians and policymakers and others think about agriculture. There's a lot of agriculture experts participating today. I'd love to hear people's thoughts, but I keep going back, and I don't know why for so long governments of different political parties have not tended to place agriculture at the center of a growth agenda. I don't know if it's because the sector is geographically distant from Ottawa, or if it's just been stuck in a perception of being a kind of traditional sector, and that policymakers haven't properly followed the extraordinary kind of explosion of progress. But it's perplexing me if you think about it. We're talking about sort of industrial policy here. Canola was conceived in a partnership between the federal government, the private sector, and universities. I mean, this is a kind of technological invention designed in Canada with a product that now owns something approximating 70% of global exports. This is a kind of a case of industrial policy done well, not just for the sector, for the country as a whole. And it's been confusing to me over the past several months as I've sort of thought about these issues, why agriculture has been neglected as part of that growth conversation. But the point is, steps like the one you're describing, I think could help, just as the Barton Report and other things have done, I think to reorient the focus of public policy and to place agriculture and agri-food where it belongs, which is just a major source of potential future growth for Canada.
Deborah, just let me say, and I agree with everything Sean has said. Let me say with the I would say growth, but really dominance of the discussion around ESG, environmental social governance, but let's look at the E and the S. I think the kinds of partnerships you've just mentioned with Chevron, we're going to see a lot more of these, because on both sides of the equation, on the energy side and on the agricultural side, companies like Nutrien, on whose board I used to sit, everybody is going to have to uptake
their game. Yeah.
Their ESG credibility, right? And all the investors are saying, you know what, you need a plan, you need benchmarks, and we will independently verify whether you're hitting your benchmarks, because we may not trust you when you tell us in-house you've hit your benchmarks.
Right.
So all of that is, I think, going to speak to the kinds of creative partnerships across industries that we have never seen before.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah. So Al, to you next, and then Karen, you get the final word. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, let me just pick up something that Sean started with a few moments ago. Back on the growth agenda, maybe I disagree with a couple of the others. But when I look through the budget, I would very much like to see ag and food focused as a driver of economic growth. And I agree with what everybody said there. But I go back to something Sean said about this pastoral dialogue that the Prime Minister and our Conservative leader had around ag and food on Agriculture Day. And this is really important, because what will happen is, if the federal government is not successful in leading that agenda, then this splinters out across province, and it's really already happening. We've got a couple Albertans on our panel here, and they know as oil and gas goes downhill, the move has to go somewhere else for economic development. And a logical place for that to go in Western Canada is into ag and food. And provincial rivalry for investments in food processing, other agricultural investments is not good for the country. And because agriculture is a joint a provincial federal responsibility, there's probably more potential for this to fragment across province, or conversely, if you get it right, to unify it, than there is anywhere else. And just wait till we have provinces that want to establish their own carbon fees. I worry about that. You know, we have a Supreme Court ruling that dealt with federal jurisdiction around carbon. Mm-hmm. And that's, and I'm no lawyer. We do have a lawyer, I think, on our panel though. I don't know if provinces decide they want to have their own carbon fees that relate to certain products, including agricultural products. They may be within their, they may have the ability to do that. And that's where I'd like to just come back briefly again to BRM. We didn't have any funding discussion around BRM in the federal budget, and ordinarily we wouldn't. But what it signals is, you know, if, and this is where this gets a little uncertain in my mind. Typically with a statutory program, small changes, you just don't worry about it. I mean, it's in the statute. If you have major policy rule changes, then I believe they probably would have to be budgeted for you. That hasn't been provided for. So what that signals, knowing nothing else than what we have here, is that the federal government is not thinking that the rules that would bring Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular into the fold with agri-stability and elsewhere in BRM. And we have to talk about BRM more widely now that Alberta has made its decision relative to crop insurance premiums that it has. So it's gone wider than just agri-stability at this point. We're missing an opportunity here, I think, for cohesion, East and West, and fighting regionalism or Western alienation, whatever you want to call it, by not dealing with ag as economic development and BRM at a national level into a true national ag policy, because this easily fragments into provincialism. We've seen it before.
Thanks, Al. Karen, final word to you. There's lots to unpack as always, and we unfortunately won't be able to deal with all the threads or the questions that came up. But Karen, over to you, and then I will turn it back to Tyler.
I'll just take 30 seconds. I know we're over time. I'll just quickly say that I appreciate Al's comments on provincial divisions and how much attention we need to pay to that.
Yeah.
And I'll echo that remark, but the question was about cross-border between US and Canada, and I'll go back there just for 10 seconds, I suppose.
Or within Canada as well. Yeah.
And within Canada. Okay. Well, I mean, when I think it's important to look to Biden's leadership on climate. I think Canada's trying to lead and keep up. In agriculture, commitments aren't yet clear as far as I'm aware. So in many ways, this investment in the federal budget is leadership from Canada. And I think ultimately that's what we want, right? It's not every government that will take the same kind of leadership in agriculture for perhaps all of the things that we've been talking about, not just climate change. And I think ultimately, you know, the more support we can get from our government direct to farmers to continue to innovate, adapt, mitigate, you know, is ultimately what we're looking for. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks. I just want to add that the Creative Destruction Labs Rockies has an agriculture stream based at the University of Calgary. It's the first one that was established in the country, and it's been surfacing some very interesting startup technologies. So tech and innovation is happening, and it's happening in Alberta, but perhaps not fast enough. So thanks very much for having me as your moderator. I really appreciated the opportunity and really enjoyed the dialogue. And I'm going to turn it back over to Tyler for final remarks.
Great. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you to all of our panelists. Again, I also really enjoyed this discussion, and clearly I think we need to set more time aside next time, because there's so much when it comes to agriculture and these big national public policy issues that can be unpacked and talked about. And again, I think it was a good start today, but this is a conversation that we need to carry on. And so again, CAPI hosts a series of these webinars throughout the year, and I'd like to highlight our next public event, which will be the Big Solutions Forum taking place on May 20th. The Big Solutions Forum is the culmination of one of CAPI's work programs from the past year, which will tie together the learnings that we've had from various dialogues and events focused on identifying potential strategies and solutions around some of these critical issues that we talked about today. If someone's looking for more information, including on how to register for our event on the 20th, please visit www.thebigsolutionsforum.ca. And finally, again, I'd like to thank everyone for taking part in the discussion today. The work that CAPI does and events like this are only possible because of the support we get from funders and people who believe in advancing the agriculture and agri-food system in Canada. There are so many different ways to support the work that CAPI does, and we're always keen to identify potential partners to support our work going forward. Please feel free to reach out to explore these different opportunities through the email located at the bottom right of the screen. Oh, it's not there, but you know, you can find it on our website. So please, we appreciate you taking part today. We appreciate again the panelists for their contributions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.